Introduction. Are you ready? If you have stumbled across this piece of writing, it is likely that you are in a crisis situation. Survival is on the line. You may not be aware of it, or you may have felt that something is indeed off about the times in which we live, but you are unable to put it into words. Perhaps you don't have any immediate physical needs, but neither do you have any hope or a plan for the future. Many of us have been living in such a way, and when faced with the question, "Are you ready?" we don't know how to answer. Ready for what? That's the real question, and the answer is unknown. Not only do we not know what we should be preparing for, but we can't know. It's not an unknown answer to the question, but the thing we must prepare for. The answer to the question, ready for what, is the unknown. How can you be ready for the unknown? If these sentiments resonate with you, I have a word of advice that will help. Don't panic. This is not a catchphrase I invented, nor do I think it's substantial enough to be claimed by any individual, as it's the sort of thing that good mothers and fathers have been saying to their children for millennia when milk was spilled or the dog ran away. My inspiration for including it here does have a particular source. This statement is emblazoned across the cover of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the non-fictional volume referred to in Douglas Adams' fictional novel of the same name, printed in large, friendly letters. I did not think it was necessary to print "Don't Panic" on the cover of this book. It's not the primary message, but it is an important first step. Panic never helped mop the floor or find a lost pet. While our situation is not quite as dire as that of Arthur Dent, the protagonist in Adam's Tale, who was suddenly whisked aboard an alien spaceship, we are still in a crisis. For many of us who grew up with all the conveniences of modern urban life, we suddenly find ourselves in a strange and alien environment. The path we were told to follow from our parents' homes in the suburbs to our own adult destiny has fallen into severe disrepair. The cracked and broken pavement quickly vanishes into a sea of weeds and brush, with only a dark wall of trees lining the horizon. Others may be able to navigate the path laid out for us, climbing to the top of the metaphorical ladder of success, only to notice that one day the familiar sights of civilization have been swallowed up by an endless expanse of desert sand. C.R. Wiley begins his excellent book, Man of the House, with an introduction on what to do when you find yourself stranded in the wilderness. There are two ways to find yourself in the wilderness. One is to come to the end of civilization and just leave it behind, either on purpose or by accident, as when you survive a plane crash in the South Pacific. The other way is for civilization to just end. Mr. Wiley wrote his book especially with the latter scenario in mind. There are many legitimate fears that civilization-ending events may be coming on the horizon. If you have grown up in the shadow of such fears, you may have experienced a feeling of helplessness. You are not responsible for the situation we are in. Half of the intended audience for this book are those who haven't even had the chance to become functioning adults, and of the other half, most have only marginal power and responsibility over a few small things. It's the bigwigs who control the levers of government, the economy, and the apparatus of communications who bear the responsibility of choices that will preserve or destroy our civilization. But the likelihood that they will smarten up and correct the course on their own is basically zero, as is the likelihood of them listening to the wise counsel of the people whose lives they are actively ruining. For those just starting out in the adventure of adulthood, the fears and concerns for the future might center around our ability to achieve the sort of normal benchmarks that seemed like a given for our parents and grandparents. Will I be able to find a steady career when traditional industries are crashing and changing all the time? Will I be able to own property that won't be seized or end up worthless due to changes in the government or economy? Will I be able to find a spouse and have a family? For those of us closer to the middle of life, those same fears become magnified when we project them onto our children. The truth is, whatever we fear, in many ways we will still be outside of our control. We can't change the course of civilization through desire or by force of will. To bank on any particular outcome will leave us vulnerable if our predictions are wrong. Whether our children's generation inherit a functioning society or a post-apocalyptic wasteland, which might be kind of fun, if we want to give them a chance at their own happy life, we need to start investing in a plan that isn't dependent on a stable form of currency, government, or technology. Here's where Wiley's advice becomes even more valuable. He outlines the essential time frames for finding such basic necessities. We can go without food for a few weeks, and without water for a few days, but shelter must be found before nightfall. The unpredictability of exposure to the cold, to dangerous weather, and to predators or villains makes it a vital necessity to find a place of protection. This concept is not hard to understand. The fight or flight response can subdue the intensity of hunger and thirst, but we cannot live in that mode indefinitely. We must regain control of our faculties to make plans, to assess our situation accurately, and find solutions. But to do so requires finding a safe place to pause and rest. Many of us have been living in a wilderness without shelter for a long time. Not a physical wilderness, but a cultural, societal, and relational wilderness. We have more access to physical necessities than at any other time in history, but our abilities to make sense of the times in which we live, our place in the world, and our goals for the future have been running on the cognitive equivalents of adrenaline and cortisol for far too long. We need to find a shelter for the storm, a place to catch our breath, to get some respite, and make a plan. Hopefully, this book will help the reader find such a place. One of the chief guiding principles to get you there is summed up in a chronological observation that I first noticed in the text of the Bible, but which seems to permeate all of life. Tents before temples. Tents before temples. There's a curious detail in the book of Exodus. God has delivered the Israelites from their slavery in Egypt, the most powerful nation in the world at that time. The Israelites were the labor force that built cities and other structures for the Egyptians. They knew construction, and they could build to last. The ancient pyramids are still among the oldest and most impressive structures in the world, and the methods of their construction continue to baffle experts. Despite our advanced technology, we are incapable of reproducing them. Yet when the Israelites are finally free, the God who has delivered them instructs them to build not a temple, but a tent to worship. In the wilderness, even God lives in a tent, not a temple. Later on, a temple would be constructed in the city of Jerusalem, but even this structure is not truly permanent. It was destroyed far more quickly than the temples and pyramids of Egypt. Yet today, billions of people know and believe in the God of the Israelites, while the temples of antiquity are devoid of worshippers. There's a couple of observations we can make about this. First, there are different concepts about permanence. The Egyptians knew how to build a structure that would last far longer than anything we have built since. Yet the customs and traditions of their culture have faded away. While the buildings remain, the far more valuable knowledge of how to build them has been lost. On the other hand, the cultures and traditions that have lasted the longest have often left the fewest traces of archaeological artifacts. The Bedouin tribes are preserving the same way of living that the Israelites and others practiced over 3,000 years earlier and more. Though no individual tent will last as long as a temple or a pyramid, the use of tents is far sturdier. But as we noted earlier, the physical necessities of survival are not so hard to come by in our day. It's a wilderness of meaning in which we are struggling to find shelter. A culture is about far more than housing. The descendants of the ancient Israelites no longer live in tents. Yet they succeeded in preserving the core elements of their culture far better than their early contemporaries. While having good tools to survive and thrive can make life easier, it's the knowledge that makes all the difference. Knowing how to build a pyramid won't help you on a desert island, or a tropical jungle, or a snow-filled tundra. And here's the secret to survival. Knowledge is costly to discover, but it's easy to share. The material value of knowledge that can be freely and quickly gained in our current age is almost incalculable. As an example, the chemical polyvinylidene chloride was discovered accidentally in 1933 and was used to create a multitude of useful products over the next several years, including a 1949 invention called Saran wrap. This product has been sitting in kitchen drawers for generations. If you are grabbing survival items out of the kitchen, the plastic wrap probably won't make it into your bug-out bag. Yet a YouTube video, just a few minutes long, documents how a single person can build a waterproof shelter out of plastic wrap in just a few minutes. Once you see it, the concept is grasped intuitively, and anyone can feel a bit more prepared for a zombie apocalypse by simply throwing a $15 roll of pallet wrap in the trunk of their car. But without that knowledge, countless people would walk by that roll, never seeing its value. Rediscovering the secret to constructing the pyramids still eludes us, but at one point it was readily passed on from master to apprentice. This point is driven home more succinctly by the economist Thomas Sowell. The caveman had the same natural resources at their disposal as we have today, and the difference between their standard of living and ours is a difference between the knowledge they could bring to bear on those resources and the knowledge used today. This points us to the core concept of this endeavor. For our own survival, success, and happiness, and that of our children, and our children's children, we need to seek wisdom and knowledge from those who have it and pass it on. Wiley shares an interesting story about what a single man can do when armed with proper wisdom and knowledge. At the age of 51, Dick Pronicki took his tools and his woodcraft skills and moved to Alaska. Single-handed, he built a cabin in the wilderness and then lived alone in it for the next 30 years. Fortunately for the rest of us, Pronicki documented his experience on film. That film is entitled Alone in the Wilderness. But even Pronicki was never truly alone. He took the traditions of woodcraft and wilderness survival with him. Tradition is the package in which we communicate knowledge and wisdom to pass it on. It's like a little map of civilization that lives inside your head. Not everything inside a given tradition is necessarily worth passing on. They can hide a lot of errors. Traditions are designed to preserve knowledge and skills, but they do so unquestioningly, which is why we keep learning old wives' tales, and why some ideas that are flat out wrong and destructive have survived far longer than they should on the basis of tradition. But whatever truly is good should be preserved in tradition. Tradition can be wrapped up in something as simple as the Scout motto, be prepared. If civilization ends and we find ourselves in the wilderness, we will be far better off having bought a tent or a roll of pallet wrap. A simple intentional choice like that will help us remember don't panic, which will lead us to notice those around us and help us remember that we too were once lost and afraid. So we will reach out and explain the path forward to those who cannot see it. This is how tradition is passed on. If we can master this process, we will be 90% of the way there. But what about that last 10%? There's another important lesson to grasp here. Remember that there is another scenario of finding yourself in the wilderness, intentionally going to the edge of civilization and leaving it behind. Here is where we can encounter the truly unknown, something tradition can't prepare us for directly, but which can be overcome. Exploring the unknown wilderness. When you are standing in a city, the world can seem pretty full. But if you look at a map of global population density, you'll quickly notice far more wilderness than civilization here on planet Earth, and some of those places could benefit from having someone settle down. Many others prove the point about the end of civilization. Deserts and jungles may seem pristine in their natural glory, but beneath the dunes and dense vegetation, not just remnants, but huge swaths of former empires have been discovered, swallowed up by the surrounding environments. Homer's epic poem, the Iliad, was long thought to be a purely fictional mythology because it spoke of cities and civilizations no one had ever seen, until 1871, when a couple of archaeologists discovered the city of Troy, buried beneath the dirt of a rural Turkish countryside. In more recent years, LiDAR technology has revealed vast networks of full-blown cities hidden in the jungles of Central and South America. Explorers had carved out paths within a stone's throw of enormous temples without ever noticing them. Wilderness is unrelenting. It's the varied and unpredictable nature of the wilderness that informs us of that second important lesson: learning to adapt to new environments. When preparing to conquer the unknown wilderness, the principle to remember is actually the same for surviving the apocalypse: tents before temples. Though he was alone, Dick Pronicke remembered that part of the responsibility in inheriting a valuable tradition includes passing that knowledge and wisdom on to the next generation. Yet he did not have the means or desire to do so in the traditional fashion, from a master to an apprentice. In fact, he was answering a question that tradition itself couldn't answer: how do you live alone? The solution he settled on was to use technology and resources outside of the tradition to document his knowledge and preserve it for others to see. It may not be perfect, but nothing ever is in the wilderness. Trial and error will eventually teach you what books and videos can't quite explain, but it's a lot harder to get there without the head start. Most people want to settle down and grow roots, but before you build a house, you still need a place to rest. In the classic pioneer story, Little House on the Prairie, Laura Ingalls Wilder spends several chapters detailing the process of her pa, Charles Ingalls, building a new home from scratch. It's a modest home, no bigger than necessary to provide the basic needs of shelter for the family. Yet the process still takes several weeks. In the meantime, the family sleeps in their covered wagon, a tent on wheels. When the house is mostly finished, Pa takes the canvas cover off the wagon and secures it over the roof beams of the house, a temporary solution until he gets the nails needed to properly shingle a permanent roof. A covered wagon and a canvas roof provide great examples of how adapting to new circumstances can be both the same and different from experiences we've tried before. To understand the principle of tents before temples, a philosopher might quibble over the definition of a tent, and the categories they use to describe a tent might disqualify both the covered wagon and the unfinished cabin from meeting the requirements. But that's to miss the point entirely. The principle of tents before temples contrasts two key aspects between the two structures: mobility and speed. A tent is the home that travels with you, and you can set it up in a reasonable amount of time. A temple is more permanent, both in time it takes to build and place. Now here's where I'll diverge a bit from Mr. Wiley, though I think he would agree with my assessment when all is said and done. His advice is on how to build a survival shelter, something you can do without bringing anything with you. But you still need to bring a tent wherever you go. Or, perhaps, as Douglas Adams' fictional survival guide suggests, what we really need is a good towel. A towel, it says, is about the most massively useful thing an interstellar hitchhiker can have. Partly, it has great practical value. You can wrap it around you for warmth. You can lie on it. You can sleep under it beneath the stars, use it to sail a mini raft, wet it for use in hand-to-hand combat, wrap it round your head to ward off noxious fumes. You can wave your towel in emergencies as a distress signal. And of course, dry yourself off with it if it still seems to be clean enough. More importantly, a towel has immense psychological value. Any man who can hitch the length and breadth of the galaxy, rough it, slum it, struggle against terrible odds, win through, and still know where his towel is clearly a man to be reckoned with. With the fictional planets and aliens removed, the Hitchhiker's Guide actually gives us some very solid advice. With this concept of adaptability expanded through the various uses of a good towel in mind, and the principle of tents before temples. Next steps. Over the rest of this book, I will touch on means to reorient our goals toward finding the best solution between the ideal and the possible. The desire for better is only good until you find good enough. After that, it's a distraction that leads to a desert full of mirages. Fixing the process of acquiring a family is the hardest in the macro, as our traditional systems have almost completely disappeared. But it's also the easiest in the micro. You only need to find one partner. Finding meaningful work is perhaps the central thesis of this project, as it can help support the other two legs of the tripod. But to do so requires help from the last area, the community and friends, usually centered around third places. The greatest of these is the local church. It's the springboard from which creative solutions to cultural crises can most easily emerge. Healthy churches are the kind of places that still hold the patterns and memories of our cultural successes. But they aren't perfect. The methods to bring people in are no longer working. As a result, most churches are dwindling in attendance, while both their members and leaders are aging. The cultural arena has changed, becoming more toxic and dangerous. Purposeful action is required to bring about restoration. But don't panic. There are solutions and actions that we can take. As we take stock of the tools and equipment we have gathered, we will use them to assess the landscape of the wilderness, discern the best methods to avoid hazards, and remove immediate obstacles. Then we will gather and organize the materials available and begin creating structures for our own survival and for strangers in need. This process will be repeated at different levels and different types of terrain, but throughout the book, everything can be viewed through this paradigm of transforming the wilderness into a thriving garden through appropriate cultivation. Everything you learn can be described as tools for clearing wilderness and building structures, methods for assessing and evaluating the terrain, knowledge to develop plans and strategies, and skills for cultivation and construction of a future home. It will take creative application of this knowledge to make it happen. My intention is to supply a broad view of these concepts with some specific examples to flesh them out. Hopefully, this mix will allow you to find a starting place to clear some metaphorical brush and stake down a tent. The beginning of a better world is no more complicated than that. So let's gather some tools and pack a bug-out bag.